Mike, I know you are one of the founders of the field of analytic theology, and I'm excited to talk to you because I have been interested in theology for most of my life, although never appreciating or never wanting to really delve into it, but just because of its nature. I was trained in science, and I've loved philosophy, so when I heard of analytic theology, because I'm interested in theology, when I heard of analytic theology, I really got excited about it. So you're one of the founders of the field. Tell me how it came about, what it is, and what it's not.
So I'll start by talking about analytic philosophy. And the field of philosophy is sort of, roughly speaking, divided into the analytic tradition and the so-called continental tradition. I think the analytic tradition is characterized by a certain kind of style and certain kinds of ambitions, and now there's, I guess a pretty significant body of literature of just work that's been done in the tradition. The style is something like, people often say, analytic philosophy tries in ways that continental philosophy doesn't to be clear. I think that's sort of a mistake. Continental philosophers try to be clear. The really good ones are very clear in certain respects. What analytic philosophers prize is a certain kind of, I realize this is a kind of synonym for clarity, but it has different valence, a certain kind of transparency specifically about one's assumptions, right? And about the structure of one's reasoning, right? So an analytic philosopher will, in the paradigm case, go out of his or her way to make really clear what they are assuming in giving their argument and what the structure of the argument is and where, the relevant inferences are and what you need to do if you want to resist the argument. And they will make efforts to avoid, purely decorative metaphor and things like that, all in the service of trying to just get as much as possible out on the table the structure of their reasoning, right? And the ambitions are, I guess I want to say, kind of explanatory theory building ambitions, right? So analytic philosophy prioritizes trying to kind of explain things, characterize things, define things, all in the service of building true explanatory theories about the world, right? And again, it's not to say that it doesn't do other stuff, but these are the priorities. And so analytic theology it takes on board these kinds of ambitions and that kind of style and works in dialogue with the literature in analytic, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and so on in doing theology.
Okay. Now, two questions from either side, because this is new. And so theology has been done a long time by theologians.
Right.
So I want to understand the difference between what theologians were doing, because they thought they were being clear. They were trying to be clear, at least on their own beliefs. And also, analytic philosophy has been applied in the philosophy of religion, because that's what I've followed for a long time. So, and many of the topics in religion, obviously, are theological topics as well. So then how does analytic theology differ from both of these prior camps?
Yeah, good. So I guess I'd want to distinguish. So medieval theology, for example, that looks a lot like analytic theology, okay? It predates the analytic tradition of philosophy, right? But in certain ways, the ambitions and even the style are pretty similar. They're fellow travelers, right? Theology of, kind of the early, middle, and late 20th century. Again, I don't want to say they aren't trying to be clear, right? A lot of it is perfectly clear. A lot of what gets called analytic isn't clear, But what they're often not trying to do is build robust explanatory theories in a way that it gets maximum exposure of the underlying assumptions and structure of the arguments and things like this. They're prioritizing different things and worthwhile things often, things like demonstrating their awareness of and the fact that they are in dialogue with certain kinds of historical figures through allusions and so on and so forth. Or maybe they're prioritizing rhetoric in certain ways to gain a certain kind of effect. Or maybe they're prioritizing the pursuit of wisdom in a way that leads them into very messy and evocative topics it's just hard to be clearer about. But they think still it's worthwhile doing because we'll get some wisdom this way. And I don't want to disparage any of that, but what the analytic theologians are doing in contrast to theology in that style is just adopting a different set of priorities with the goal of doing things like, trying to reason very carefully and in this transparency about assumptions and arguments and clarity about definitions sort of way about the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of the Incarnation, and things like that, right? Now, you also asked about the relationship to philosophy of religion. I guess I think the difference here, analytic philosophy of religion versus analytic theology, is these are just disciplines with a lot of, but not perfect, topical overlap.
Yeah,
right?
and I guess the theology, in a sense, could be a subset of philosophy of religion. The philosophy of religion may have dealt with just some concepts about God and Trinity and incarnation, but theology maybe does just has other kinds of things, whether it's liturgy or the church, that may characterize it differently. Philosophy of religion seems like a bigger category.
Right. But I guess I also think there are some activities that I would describe as analytic theology that really, I think they're probably not appropriately described as philosophy of religion.
What are they? I'd be interested in that.
Say you're trying to figure out the entailment relations among the core doctrines of Calvinism, the tulip, total depravity, unconditional election, and so on and so forth. And you're trying to do that in a very confessional way. I think a lot of people in philosophy of religion would be reluctant to say that's philosophy of religion. You're really that's a theological project. It's got philosophical aspects and so on and so forth. But you're
all right. That's fair. So what you would do to that process would have been which was carried on anyway, is now bring it to the rigor of analytic philosophy to those kinds of questions, which is a theological one.
Yeah. And there are questions in philosophy of religion that I think aren't strictly speaking.
No, that's for sure.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Okay.
So the question is whether they're Venn diagrams that overlap, or is analytic theology a subset of philosophy of religion? I think you're saying they're Venn diagrams that overlap.
Yeah, that's what I want to say.
And maybe philosophy is larger in terms of the scope of project, but each one is very rich. What's the arguments that if you're too much analytic, you can maybe destroy the essence of the theological message, which could be told in stories or in metaphor or in kind of emotional encounters that are not reducible to the analytic method. I assume you're sensitive to those kinds of...
Yeah. I think analytic theology is a particular activity with a particular kind of use, right? And it does very well some of what we want to do in theology. It does very poorly some other things that we want to do in theology. I think a kind of nice vignette is I went in to do a class on the problem of evil, which certainly has theological aspects. But I was starting the discussion the day after a student had died on campus in a very tragic accident, right? And I went in and just announced to the class, look, we're going to talk about this problem of apparently pointless evil. We're going to talk about it in a very analytic way, but and that could seem kind of crass in the wake of something like this terrible tragedy. You don't give analytic theological arguments to people who are in the midst of dealing with suffering and stuff like that. But being well-versed in the analytic theological arguments can genuinely help a person down the road as they are, they've finished or at least substantially worked through a lot of their grief over the suffering, and now they're trying to think sensibly about what they ought to do with their faith in the wake of it. And knowing some analytic theology can be really helpful with that sort of thing.